Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a story about my escapades, so I'm just going to tell you shaggy dog stories. There's a point to it. I'm a reader and applied global ethics, and most of you are thinking, what the hell is that? Well, it's saying that there's certain security options up which we should not put. So what are you going to do about it? Are we going to be social astronomers, or are we going to play games? Are we going to interact? So this is the story of essentially Echelon, and the European Library Service done their first archive historical report on the Echelon affair. You've all heard about Edward Snowden and those revelations. I published on it 40 years ago using open sources. So I want to give you that story and how it came about, and I want to address the issue of secrets. Can a secret be a secret if it isn't really secret? But I'll put it into a different framework. Can we be research activists and change the universe? Snowden came out with the idea that he couldn't allow the US government to destroy privacy, and he was willing to put his life and time on the line by releasing data that was literally earth-shattering. And what I want to do is use a series of examples to show how you go about opening secrets and how you can focus on particular areas. I'm going to focus on security technology, and I'm going to look at paradigm shifts, because everyone sees the world through a lens, and the game is, if there's only one or two people who've got your lens, your view doesn't have any power. So it's how do you go about actually maximizing the number of people that know? If it's a really dirty secret, then you're in trouble. You've got to move very, very fast, otherwise you become the target. So this is about moving targets and surviving the research process. The key is like what we're doing here. It's networking to actually share the paradigms. I apologize for some of the images. I won't dwell too much, but you should know this stuff exists in your world. But my story begins as a kid going east, and I don't know if you recognize it, but that's Bandi Amir in Afghanistan. So I'm on the run into Afghanistan, and it's nearly 5 decades ago. And we had a conversation in the Buddhas of Bamyan that have now been destroyed by the Taliban. And we were curious. We're saying, well, the dogs around here and the wolves are incredibly big. There's nothing to eat. How on earth are they getting that big? And we kind of thought maybe they're digging up the graveyards. Well, the next morning I got a rude awakening because I went out to take some of the pictures of the Buddha, and I heard, and I thought, what the? And I saw a pack of dogs running. And I thought, why are they running? And basically, they spotted breakfast, and it was me. And the notion that you've got communication, command, and control in the animal and the machine, that's what this is about. Can those wolves talk English? No, they're talking raw aggression. I've got 10 seconds. And if I don't make the right decision in those 10 seconds, I will cease to be. So my security is right on the line. There's no way to intellectualize it. I'm going to be a killer in 5 seconds. They're closing in. And I start throwing rocks, and I'm not a good shot. But in that energy, the adrenaline, I start to hurt that pack, and they back off. And my heart and my mind is just awake. And it's like, okay, that's what security is about. It's like the flight of being from nothingness. But it's also about revealing what's hidden. There's all sorts of pixels there, but if you put enough of it together, you've got the mosaic without having the full picture, and then you can play games. So we're going to address this idea of open secrets. There's horrible pictures, but basically a guy getting into a new, I won't dwell on that, but it's a new way of rubberizing cities. What Dean talked about this morning, and Stephen Graham is saying, it's a new approach to fighting modern wars. Everywhere's a battle space. Every place you walk to as a human being now has a target plan. And part of that target plan is demodernizing modern cities, turning them off, turning them back to the Stone Age. Russia modeled that in Chechnya, but getting the image was the important thing. What are they doing on the ground? In my town, when I was doing some of this work, there was the biggest private arms warehouse on the planet. Sam Cummings was the model for Frederick Forsyth and the Merchant of Death. And he was quite philosophical. He said, I think it's wrong to deal in arms, you know, it's wrong. But if the government don't legislate, then I will sell to both sides. He armed apartheid. He swept up weapons from the battlefield and recycled them to every terrorist. He went to Cuba. They went all over the world. And I was really pissed off by this. But at the time, there was a book by Douglas Adams where Arthur Dent, there's like a highway going to be built through our solar system, and they posters to notice in Alpha Centauri saying it's coming. And I thought, that's inspirational. So I went to the director of planning at the city council saying, could you realign the inner relief road? And I said, why? I said, they're arming apartheid. I said, okay, we'll shift a position on a map. And they drove the road through the arms factory. I was really happy. There's the inner relief road, and inter-arms exists no more. And you can read the story. There's books on Sam Cummings. I think if you did a Google search on him, you'll find that he was shot by his daughter with one of his own guns that were left in the house. And that's part of my research. I want to destroy the topic of my research. So the early years were quite difficult. I did a Bachelor of Science at Manchester, and one of my studies I found at the medical school was frying cats with a new agent. And I thought, oh, what is that? One of the agents was pepper gas. This is 1975. And the other was something called dibenzoxazepine. It's about 6 times more powerful than CS. And I exposed him in New Scientist. And he said, look, the only ethical thing that bothers me is some git's going to put a letter bomb through my door. And that stayed with me. And I've found that there's many countries have adopted CR. You've never heard of it. There's allegations it was field tested in Long Kesh in Northern Ireland in '73. A lot of those people that say they were attacked with it have now developed a weird form of eye leukemia. So I keep on bashing on that we need open knowledge about these, because the damage of the security solution might only be apparent years later. So I've focused on something called harmless weapons, and it's a PR exercise. So tear gas, I mean, it'd be more accurate to say it's vomit gas. They're not non-lethal, they're sub-lethal or pre-lethal or less lethal. And what you'll see behind the gas grenade, there's always a lethal option. Become obvious why I'm concerned about that. The question is, would perceptions change if they said the police were using vomit gas? Or are they using skin fryer weapons? These are all measured impacts. If you get gassed with CS, about 4% of people will have contact dermatitis for the rest of their lives. Or eye gouges. Plastic bullets will break the internal organs. But how do you actually talk about this? I don't know if you've all seen a plastic bullet. It's about this big. And it's like the inside of a toilet roll. It weighs twice the weight of a cricket ball, fired twice the speed of the fastest fast bowler. But most media commentators think they're little squidgy things that police are using restraint. That's a gas weapon. And the thing is that the reality of those images are disgusting, and there's a PR around the security solutions that phases them out. One of the fantasies was that when you have a terrorist attack, you would actually be able just to simply attack combatants and terrorists with the same weapon, put them all to sleep. And of course, the BMA said you can't do that because one purpose, tranquilization of this lethal dose, but there's a massive body of study. Where do you find it? You go into the universities. The idea of calmatives, the Sunshine Project got the data and thought, well, what are they doing? The idea is that they're beginning to test this. So in the Moscow theater siege, they used a fentanyl compound, but they didn't tell any of the medics what was being used. So 139 people died. The terrorists were shot. It's like extrajudicial execution on the spot. But the twist in this is it didn't work because they couldn't gauge the dose. This woman here is Dr. Schreiber. She's an anaesthetist in Prague University. She went to a military conference I went to and said, look, if we put the antidote in, we could, as they were dying, they'd be waking up. And she thought, I can make lots of money by advocating a new weapon. And the thing I've got is I can test this on kids. And she did. In her presentation, she was testing on children. And that was one of the conditions for testing these new weapons. And I thought, you've got an ethical dilemma here. Reporter in The Guardian and watch the world's media make a beeline to a door. And that caused her enormous harm. and that was deliberate and intentional. She stopped work on that area. But it's really hard because sometimes you've got to do things that are slightly dodgy. When I was director of the Omega Foundation, we discovered that the pepper gas that you hear about that's being used in Calais and elsewhere, the safety testing on that had been facilitated by a $55,000 bribe to Special Agent Ward by the owner of a company called Lucky Strike Products that happened to be her husband. And when I published that, the company said, "We'll see you in court." We never have had that relationship. It's a lie. We want exemplary damages. We want apologies. Get down on your knees or die professionally. Fortunately, I went to an arms fair in Jordan, and such is my want. I stole all the documents from the Zark International desk because they went out to lunch. And I had a big bag, and I had their technical manual. And in that document, everything they said I lied about was there. And I thought, I've got the one jigsaw puzzle piece. It's only existed in one place on Earth for one moment. I've got it. See you in court. I'd love to. And they backed off. So there's an issue of political jiu-jitsu here. Can you take on organizations more powerful than yourself? The key thing is that it's really hard to do that when you're starting out. It's better to get involved with a bigger organization that has the expertise. I ran the Omega Foundation because we were interested who made this stuff. What are their names? On what streets do they live? And it was done by field work. So we worked with Amnesty to look at things like this killing house. It was called a rescue facility when you talked about it in Europe. When you went abroad, the company making this said, we'll do a simulation. We'll build up mock brothels, mock villages where you can kill everyone in there, and we'll simulate killing crowds. And so to follow it through, we tried to buy it for a mine in Jakarta. No, it was Caracas. But the real target was Jakarta. They'd sold this to the Indonesians. And we made a TV program getting them to confess. It was things like the slave trade. We found that the guys that made the leg irons for the slave trade in Birmingham were still making the stuff. And again, we kind of exposed them to try and stop the trade. And I'm a member of the European Parliament's Torture Export Committee. I mean, surreal conversations to try and stop this in the 21st century. And some of this is open, like this. It comes from the Commodity Control List. It's like US government license for export of implements of torture. So straitjackets, shields. You'll see that there are zap gloves, like just for beating people up with lead in them, but specially designed implements of torture. So you've got a code number. You can now say, could you tell me to which countries the sales were made under item 499B? And the bureaucrats will say, there. All your top torturers, all supplied by America, shock equipment, leg irons, thumb cuffs. So you enter this world where you thought it didn't exist, but there it is. It's like torture equipment to the torturing states. But where are you going to get the evidence? And it means you've got to do field work. And that means going into the places where they sell this stuff. So the first journey that we went to was to Miami, and you start learning what to get, because the first time you're so nervous about being an arms dealer in an alien environment, you don't get the data, and you must get the data. Then you find that you can get commissioned. So I was commissioned by Amnesty International to get into a Turkish arms fair, symbol Dove of Peace. And I wanted to find the British equipment that was being used to assassinate. There's 2,000 villages were taken out, the clampdown on the Kurds. And it was done with British technology. This is a Land Rover with double machine guns and infrared sights, so you can kill people in the dark. But Amnesty said, if you don't get any pictures, we won't pay your expenses. If you get caught, you're not with us. It's like, oh, I love NGOs. But it was like a baptism of fire. So very gradually, it's like, can you get anywhere? And I got a grant from the European Commission for 20 years to go to every arms fair on Earth. So what we heard about this morning in terms of Thales, they're talking about putting 1 billion Chinese on file, biometrics. So one of the issues is it might be democratic in a democratic country, but what do they do with that control technology when it's not democratic, and who gets it later on? So there's equipment there that will heat you up. things for stringing you up. I think I've got, yeah, there's all sorts of torture systems in China. So things for putting prisoners from the ceiling, thumb cuffs, weird and wonderful things for beating prisoners to a pulp. Electric shock, this is the wool stick. Now, we were so horrified by this, we thought, well, who buys this stuff? And who would actually re-export it? And if you want to find out, if you do a search for Mark Thomas and the After School Arms Club, what Mark, we work with comedians on this, it's great fun. What Mark said is that arms dealing is so easy, a child could do it, so we got the children to become arms dealers, and they bought everything. They rang up and said, can I buy a tank, please? Instead of saying, does your mother know you're using the phone? They said, do you want marketing or sales? And they actually bought a sting stick and went to Parliament and said, we're kids, how come we can buy this? How can we buy torture and electric shock technology? How is it possible? Capture nets. You've heard of the X-Files, it does exist. One of my jobs was to walk into the military base in Quantico. The only fortunate thing is it's saying deadly forces authorized, no photography. All I had was cameras. We walked straight past security and tried to get data of what they were doing. This is an automated machine gun. This is a weapon system that can fire 500,000 rounds a minute. So the state-of-the-art technologies. This is the X-Rep. It's a sort of taser for shooting at a distance. Used in the UK illegally a couple of years ago against Raoul Moat. It didn't work. He committed suicide. The guy that sold him it, the technology specialist that was responsible for all taser imports in the UK, committed suicide. But if it had worked, every police force in Europe would have had the X-Rep. Weird and wonderful, a briefcase that can shoot a submachine gun, robotic killing systems. But basically, my role is to focus on destroying the target of my research. And the key thing is targeting. Now, the core content is when I was a PhD, I was at Lancaster University, and there was some researchers saying, we're getting ready for World War III. And what they're beginning to do is build cities under the streets so the elite can survive. And we're curious about how they would talk to each other because there was all these weird and wonderful aerials springing up around the UK. So Peter Lorre wanted to do a new copy of his book. When it was published, it just kept blank pages. And there were reasons for that because I was asked to take pictures of the aerials at the back of my university. And I couldn't understand them. One was pointing to Northern Ireland, and it led to, in straight lines, microwave towers. They communicate 25, 30 miles on. You can track them. And it seemed to be going into the North York Moors. There's nothing there but a fairly sensitive National Security Agency base at Menworth Hill. In fact, it's the biggest base station of the NSA on the planet. Now, it was possible to model what was going on using open sources because we had telephone directories that showed us where the communication should be, but there were also these hidden routes in dark, and it all centered in the middle on that point there, in the very heart of the map. I'll just show you. And we did that through Mills methods. He kind of looked at what should exist, looked at what did exist, took one away from the other, and then everyone got arrested. And the reason for that was we actually had an illegal vision. So the secret police came onto our university and then threatened the vice chancellor. You can imagine. I said, what is it that I've done wrong? They said, what you've done wrong is so secret, we can't tell you what it is, but you've got to tell us why it is that you've done it. And that was the map. I mean, I nearly knew that creating a model was illegal, but we said, well, there's the university motto. The university motto is basically patet omnibus veritas, truth lies open to all. So the VC said, look, there's questions of academic freedom at stake here. The special branch said, we don't give a fuck about academic freedom, we're going to start breaking this place up. And then we all took a deep intake of breath and thought, what is this about? There then followed a trial that was known as the ABC trial. I mean, I suspect no one in the audience has ever heard of it, but it was very important. Why? Because what we were at the very beginning of was satellite surveillance of all the planet's telecommunications. We'd stumbled across the entrails of it. Binology is about the idea of getting data and getting it from raiding bins. So this is the Menwith Hill base station. There's many more radomes now, but the data was got by field research.
Last time we went to Nuclear Watch, 32.
32. So a massive increase in the last decade or so since 9/11. There's been lots of peace protesters there, and they're wonderful women. Never underestimate the power of middle-aged women, because people do, and they're fantastic researchers because they're invisible and they know their power. These were incredibly brave women. They broke in there 500 times. And what they did, there were dogs on site, but the dogs actually, they had a little tan of dog meat. They patted their heads, rolled over and had their tummies tickled. The woman actually found there were black plastic bins there full of documentation. And what they did with those was that they could start naming the roles and functions of some of the things on site. So Steeplebush and Moonpenny, I think. Some of the runways were responsible for particular zones on Earth, but the bulk of the architecture was in space. So you had the beginnings of $1 billion phone tap, even then, in the late 70s, early 80s. And what these women did was allow researcher Duncan Campbell, that had been one of the original defendants, to model. Also allowed the New Zealand researcher Nikki Hager to write the most boring book, but it was fantastically well researched. No one read it, but I did, because I'd waited 20 years. So if you're involved in a piece of research that you never get to the end of, don't give up hope. 2 decades later, I thought, it's payback time. I've got to write a report, but it's not Steve Wright anymore. I'm now the Director General of Research for the European Parliament, because all the reports are under that person's name. And that was it. It's the appraisal of the technologies of political control. There was something like 16 pages on this. But it was a question of how can we get people to believe this? For the Germans, this was a worldwide network of satellites and connections across many bases of the National Security Agency. What we decided was we'll leak it. And we leaked it to not the Guardian, but the Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph said, look, within Europe, all the phones, emails, and faxes are being intercepted. And it's like, oh my God, it's in the Telegraph. It must be true. Bang. Every newspaper on Earth carried that story. And then there's Dear State Watch. I mean, it's so important to us. But in December, I gate crashed the State Watch Christmas party. That's the kind of person I am, for those that know me. And Tony Bunyan was there saying, I've got 400 documents. Now, I'll ask the audience, have anyone ever heard of K4? I hadn't. But K4 committee had a new member. There were now 15 members of the European Union. The 16th member was called the United States. And what the United States said is they wanted to tap all the phones for the FBI's purposes, but they'd all gone privatized. So they wanted the European Union to make all of the phones accessible. This was called the requirements, and the decision was made by written procedure, which meant that 15 faxes were sent, and the parliaments of the individual member states couldn't change 1 comma, 1 full stop. Tony had 400 documents to back this up. I said, Tony, I can't use it unless you publish. Tony's a journalist that works to deadlines. Tony worked to deadlines. And he published it. And because he published that, I was able to incorporate it. So we then had a network of people saying something's going on here. But the date is 1997. So 15 or so years before Snowden. And then all the French, being hypocrites on this, said that this, it's an Anglo-Saxon spy system. And almost every serious journal did the analysis. 2 million calls an hour. And the big issue was who was the targets. In those days, we found from Nikki Hager, it was the Red Cross, Christian Aid, not terrorists, but Amnesty International. So part of it was like, what is this about? Why are you concerned? And The Echelon report they've just produced gives it all about privacy. They weren't really interested in privacy. What they were about was there was 120 billion euros had been siphoned off from the system. That's like $1 million a week since Christ was a baby. Serious espionage. They commissioned new work, and the best of it, if you're interested, is Duncan Campbell's Interception Capabilities 2000. I'll whiz through this because what basically Duncan did was to reveal the physical entrails, tapping the cables that take our transatlantic communications across the ocean, talking about the names of the various satellites and microwave communication systems, and then looking at the role and function of these networks. The European Parliament set up the temporary Echelon Committee, and as we were meeting in Venice as the European group, they went to America. And it was just days before 9/11, when, as you know, the NSA failed to get the 9/11 bombers, and were rewarded with even more finance. So it was about doing more field work. We found that Britain was spying on its allies through this little place in Capenhurst. There was all sorts of detail on this. But very few people really knew very much about it until Snowden. Why was that? Well, there wasn't the kind of official documentation that's needed to convince most people. And the big twist in this is that according to the American Committee for Civil Liberties, it's the military. The military's concerned with targeting. It's not about invading privacy, it's targeting, and that has implications. So where is all this data going? You're being watched, your phones are being intercepted. It's never happened in human history. Even GCHQ itself is impressed. So they're talking about, at that time, storing 3 days of the whole internet. 600 million telephone events every day, tapping 200 fiber optics, but it's the equivalent of the British Lending Library every day, 192 times over. Unbelievable capacity, but not targeting terrorists, targeting allies in negotiations over GATT, negotiations over arms deals, negotiations over commercial products, spying on friends. And then looking at how the social media were colluding with this. And the idea that when you make an email, 850,000 people have got access, it causes pause for thought, because who doesn't have a mobile in this room? I'm the only one. Who hasn't switched theirs off? Okay, I'm voice printed. So if your mobile phone's picked up my voice, you're not my friend. And what I say to my students, it always works. None of the other lecturers get people to switch their mobile phones off. You don't want to be my friend, because it means all your friends are watched. I always pick on somebody that comes to my lectures, and I'm round off now. Somebody always comes in late, and I say to them, well, if you've got contacts, how fast does that amplify? And they're more interested in sex than anything. So I pick on the person that's come in. I said, do you know, research has shown that people on a lifetime have an average of 7 sexual partners. The class laughs because some of them had 7 sexual partners in the last week. But I force the person that's come in, I say, you've got a calculator on your phone, haven't you? Can we just do the connections on that? So the first contact you have is 7 times 7, that's 49. The third contact is 7 times 50, that's 350. By the time they've got to 7, so you've just had 7 friends, potentially interconnections is 1 million. And it means that in terms of what you can do, if you just had 7 friends, you've got an arrest list in a time of terror that the authorities can legitimate arresting 1 million people on the basis of 7 contacts each. Because no one's really answered the question, what are you doing with this leverage? Why are you interested in the sex texting? If you're wanting to get the inside technical story of this, Duncan Campbell has just published a report, GCHQ and Me, you can get it online, and that talks about the techniques of assembling this stuff from largely open sources. Where do we go from here? Well, targeting is part of it. We're back to hunting uncooperative humans. The drones that are being used in the Middle East and Yemen are being targeted by the NSA. They're being drafted into targets. Their mobile phones can be targeted by that system, just as yours can. And it means that military robots of the future can be programmed to go after individuals based on their face or their telecommunications. And it's algorithms. You can change the algorithms. We heard a bit about that this morning, the suppressed demand in the system. And if the politics change, then the hidden capacities can be made real for politically expedient reasons. Where I'll end is in terms of these open secrets. I've talked to a few people here. One of my students was given the computer of the 7/7 London bombers to repair. And he went to the West Yorkshire police, and because he was concerned about the content on there, he said, these are really bad guys, they're planning something horrible. And the Yorkshire police said, we know who the bad guys are, now piss off. If they'd listened to him, had gone round to the houses, they would have preempted that attack. They would have actually stopped the doubling of MI5, which has increased to twice the size now. And it's like, well, we're back to the point Tim made this morning, and Dean made, that the solution to security problems is seen as technology. We need to start thinking about human security and listening to what we want and how we want these relationships to develop in the future. And this is part of that role. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Well, we've got a bit of time for questions and comments.
Stunned in the silence.
You mentioned human security at the end there. You could say a bit more about how you think we could mobilise around that concept in academic work and society.
It's a really hard question because when you come to financing security research, 2/3 of it in Europe is being won by the companies making the technical fixes. And the organizations that are doing a real job of talking to people at very low cost, like Peace Force, get very, very little money. So for very little investment, you could have results that weren't dramatic, but that could yield a better set of outcomes. And I think that it's not, it's about funding. You know, if we started saying, let's be creative. How many people would pay 1 cent for every email they sent? So if I said, okay, there's going to be a peace tax, a globalization, climate change tax on the entire email system. We need a national, an international UN-sponsored agreement on that, but all that money is going to be used to fund the impacts of climate change to make sure we have human responses. We've got the finance, because the objection is, look, we can't do this. We've got to feed the bankers. No, we don't. We can actually deal with money, because the existing system, this is the Naomi Klein model of saying the existing system is set up to extract money from the poor to give it to the wealthy. And so if we're thinking about human security, it's following the money in a different way and saying we need to finance alternative futures and be creative with that and create careers that haven't been invented yet, to make it sustainable, to make it livable, because what we've seen with the migration crisis is that one country or one entry port has to struggle with finding a solution. That's not the way to go with this. You've got to start thinking as a whole system, whole planetary system. And systems thinking for politicians is very, very hard. It's always short-termism. But I think one of the roles of this group is to say, look, we need to start thinking outside of the box and piloting new approaches to security that are less expensive but more people-oriented and more feminized. There needs to be more women in the security networks that will start putting a different priority list in there. It's far too masculine.
The reason I asked about that is because I've just been sent a message from the International Association of Social Equality, who are putting to the UN a manifesto statement that they want a lot of academics to sign into, which is about sustainability, economic, political, societal sustainability issues, but also human security. And I think what you just explained very well in what they're trying to achieve.
Well, I'd love to put a peace tax on every weapon. So you'd have to create an international apparatus for collecting that money. But because you've got a very, very good system of monitoring money laundering and tax evasion, you've got the architecture in place. Because the big challenge is who's going to fund. And everyone has these fine words, but you've got to find a money chain that is novel, unusual, and actually punishes people that are stealing money from our systems for security agendas that don't deliver. And I would sign. I will sign if you let me. All right.
I had a question for you, actually, Steve. One of your slides had a sort of export note from the US, and there was something quite interesting at the bottom of that I was reading, and it's that it wasn't for export to NATO, Australia, New Zealand or Japan, but apparently you could send any hideous device out there to Latin America or somewhere else. Do you know anything about how that was an interesting little legal...
I focused on members of NATO because Turkey is a member of NATO, and it was. I'll give you the answer. When I read it, you start reading it like Pravda. So we said, why is there not? What's going on here? And it's like, what's missing? And what we found in the UK is that anything that was being dealt with by the Crown agents didn't need an export license. So I put a question down. How many exceptions are there to the arms control licensing regime? And when the fax machine got to 17 pages of exceptions, I thought, it's all a fig leaf. If you're part of the Crown agents, you're giving the security technology. And the challenge to us was, how are you going to expose that? And the focus was Timor, East Timor. And we were saying, well, what's Britain? We've seen what America's doing. What's Britain doing? We put a parliamentary question down. And parliamentary questions are really good. They put money in to get the answers. We said, how many armoured vehicles are going to Indonesia? And the answer came back, 7 water cannon and ancillary equipment. So we're in the office, and it's nearly Christmas. We're in the office saying, why did they mention ancillary equipment? And it's like, we'll ask. So put a question down, what's the ancillary equipment? And then 3 days before Christmas, the answer came back really quickly. 300 armoured vehicles with submachine guns and ground to surface like satellites. And it's like, you bastards, you were lying. What are you going to do about it? And the answer is, we'll try and get a team to buy that equipment. And we did, we put it together, and we got the Nobel Peace Laureate, Jose Ramos Horta, to be the arms dealer. I mean, I won't bore you now with all the details, but we set up a deal to go and see the technology in situ, and then report, and to try and lever. It's called Profit Before Principle. I think you'll find it online, and you'll get the detail there. But it's important because when you see this official document and you're trying to puzzle what certain anomalies mean, you've got a research project. Because as soon as you open that question, you think, oh God, I've never heard that before. And then you start getting down to the minutiae of holes that allows things to go through that shouldn't go through. And that's where we begin our research, is to find the contradictions in anomalies. So, yeah,
I suppose I'm sort of wondering, is there... Obviously, there's a huge trade in arms amongst NATO countries, and for the US, the biggest producer of arms. But I suppose I was just wondering, with some of the more sort of just creepy technology, with some of the things it does, is there a tendency to export it to the global south in places where it'll be less regulated and where manufacturers can actually see it in use? I mean, in other words, are they using it as testing grounds for equipment that then floats back into the European Union? And that would be my question.
The international arms market's really promiscuous. Unbelievable kind of transactions go on, but China will steal everything it can and then reverse engineer, and then sell to countries that can't afford the Bosch stuff but can afford the Chinese version. So it's very, very hard to disentangle. The more exotic stuff is not there yet. I've given you a glimpse. You'll doubt it, I hope, for like another 5 or 10 years. But remember this moment in 10 years' time, and you think, that weird guy talked about this. So if he knew that then, what's now on the horizon? What's weirder is that no one builds weapons anymore. They build subsystems. So one of the research projects, and don't ever do this, you need to be on the spectrum of Asperger's to actually start it. And I'm not, but I've been put through it. In a weapon, you might have 1,000 bits. So lock, stock, and barrel made by separate manufacturers. So in a community like yours, you might find the street down the road that you think is just making springs or making bits and pieces is actually putting components together for a major weapon system. And until you do the research, you can't find, but you might find out their spring has a little bit that's attached to it made by another company. So you have this dependency of like hundreds of thousands of companies building these systems. So if we talk about human security, you're going to have to reverse all of that and put human-centric industries into the security chain. But it's a research job and a half, and it'll become meaningful as this thing starts to come together, because some of you might face this technology and you'll be very, very angry. You'll think, who made that stuff? Or why have my children or my friends or my relatives been damaged or processed in that way? And I urge you to do a bit of research on your local area, and if you don't want to publish it yourself, find a network that's interested in that data. It might just be one address, it might be one company, but you can help. That's it. Thanks very much.
If there's anything, yeah.